Support comes from the Rosa Parks Museum on Troy University's Montgomery campus. Located on the spot of Mrs. Parks' historic 1955 arrest and featuring exhibits that chronicle the history of the Montgomery bus boycott. More information at troy.edu/Rosa Parks.
From Troy Public Radio, Troy University, and the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama, this is It Came from the Archives. I'm Greg Phillips. Each episode, we delve into the archives to bring you a topic, introduce you to someone new, or tell you a story about the Wiregrass region and the surrounding area. Our guide is Dr. Marty Olaf, Director of the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University. Today, we take it for granted that we can access any book or magazine from the comfort of our own homes. Of course, before the internet, some travel would have to be involved to unite books and their readers. Ostensibly, this would involve the readers making their trek to the local library. But in the early 20th century, some chose to take the opposite approach by packing up the library and taking it on the road. The nation's first bookmobile began in 1905 and was pulled by a team of horses. And it wasn't long before the idea spread to Alabama.
One of the most interesting things to me, and something I tell my students, is that everyday objects, little traces of things can become the spur to send you off into basically the rabbit hole of historical research. And that's what happened in this case. One of the collections that we were working with in the Wiregrass Archives, and we had to scan a bunch of photographs from this collection, even to see what they were because they were negatives, was of the Bookmobile. It was a 1984, I want to say, image of a Bookmobile from the Dothan Public Library, at that point the Houston Love Memorial Library, and it's since changed its name. But that sent us off into some historical reminiscing. What is it about bookmobiles? Where do they come from? I mean, nothing just springs forth like Athena from Zeus's head. Everything has a background. Everything has a history. And so I began looking at the history of that bookmobile, which led me into the history of bookmobiles in general. And bookmobiles are a way for 20th century city libraries and 21st century city libraries to serve rural customers, rural patrons, without having to build facilities and figuring out ways to move books back and forth to much smaller facilities out in underpopulated areas, because you got to be really conscious of your revenue stream and how you use your resources and all of that. Well, anyway, bookmobiles have a history that goes back to probably about 1902, when the Hagerstown, Maryland library under librarian Mary Titcomb created what she then called deposit stations, crates of books, 30 to 40 books per crate, put into rural stores and rural churches. It's a little like today's Little Free Library program, where you see people just put up a small enclosure and they call it Little Free Library, and they put books in and people come take books out, and then other people come and put books back in. The book exchange didn't happen in Maryland in 1902, but the main library in Hagerstown continued to fill these deposit stations and switch out the books occasionally. Kind of interesting when you compare that to the Dothan Library that opened in 1901 in just off of what was then downtown Dothan. That was called a free library, and you have to put scare quotes around the word free, because anyone could come in. Again, it's South Alabama, so anyone means any white person could come in and read the books, but to check the books out, you had to be a member of the library, which cost some nominal amount of dues, a couple of bucks a year, I think, which actually reasonably steep for 1901. But eventually, the Carnegie libraries got involved in creating these little branches, you might say, deposit boxes and things like that. Andrew Carnegie had created a foundation. Apparently, he felt really guilty about the way he'd amassed his wealth. And well, I mean,
imagine that.
He's a Presbyterian, and I think it really played on him quite a bit. And so he created the Carnegie Foundation, which we know a lot about because it's still around. And one of the first programs that Carnegie sponsored was library building and library promotion. And we see a number of Carnegie libraries. Eufaula has a Carnegie library, for example. Other smaller towns still have their Carnegie library building, even if it's not used as a library building. But Carnegie also supported library programs. And in fact, the Hagerstown, Maryland Library in 1905 was able to get Carnegie Foundation funding for a wagon with bookshelves. And this was probably the first bookmobile in U.S. history. At least it's the first one that we can document.
Was this a horse-drawn wagon?
Yep, horse-drawn wagon. They hired the library custodian to drive the thing out into the country. He had been a peddler, and then he knew all of the unmarked county roads, which is another thing. You know, we drive around on county roads and we say, oh, there's a number marker and there's a number marker and it's on a map. That didn't exist in 1901. These roads were just trails. You'd ask for direction. People would lie to you because they thought it was funny, send you off into oblivion somewhere. But this library custodian had been a peddler. He knew all of these roads. So he rode circuit out there, and that lasted until 1910 when, of course, a train ran into the wagon.
Why does it feel like every time that we do one of these episodes, something involving a train crash happens?
Trains were ubiquitous. Trains were absolutely ubiquitous in this era, and it's the era I kind of focus on. But also, for some reason, the Wiregrass Archives has a lot of train photographs.
And seemingly trains were just hitting everything back then.
If you weren't careful, a train would hit you. You know what they say, the light at the end of the tunnel might be an onrushing train.
That's true.
So, they upgraded in 1920 to a motorized bus. And by that time, trucks and buses were beginning to replace horse-drawn wagons. Of course, there was overlap for the next 35 years. So, one of the things that led to bookmobile spreading was not only a little uptick in the amount of money that was available, the idea that libraries were a public good and that cities had something of a responsibility to assist the lifestyle of the countryside. There was even a movement begun under Teddy Roosevelt that published a book of findings in 1913 called the Country Life Movement. It was an attempt to keep people in the country by making transportation easier and by making the country less isolated, the countryside, rural areas less isolated, having more services and things like that. So there was this connection between cities and their surrounding countryside. A lot of people thought that there should be a pretty tight connection between those, and I suspect that people involved in libraries were at the forefront of that kind of thought process. So they certainly had the capacity to expand their project, the library, into the countryside, and they did so as motorized transport became much more available and as this idea spread, and then as the concept of the subscription library began to change over to the idea of free public libraries, truly free, where people not only could go in and read for free, but could also check books out for free, which implies tax support for the libraries as a revenue stream. Now, the Dothan Bookmobile is completely linked to the development of the first truly free public library in Dothan, which occurred in 1949. Between 1901 and 1949, the Dothan Library was a subscription library.
Meaning you had to pay that nominal fee.
You paid a membership fee, basically in order to check books out. And the little research I've done into the Dothan Library indicates that in 1901, when they opened, they had about 350 books. Over the years, they had accumulated a fairly large supply of books. They moved 3 or 4 times, and in 1949, they moved into a longer-term facility that was purpose-built for the library. And that was off of Troy Street in what is now downtown Dothan. That same year, they hired their first professional full-time library director, a woman named Marion Neal, a native of Sandusky, Ohio, who had been lured to the South by friends at Auburn, and then she had spent 3 years as the Bookmobile librarian for Florence, Alabama. So she went just about as far in the state as you could, from Florence down here to Dothan. And she became the librarian at the Dothan Library and was there until, I want to say, 1964. I may be incorrect about that. Nevertheless, the Dothan Service League, which had just recently been organized just a few years earlier by women interested in civic improvement, then donated $2,700 for a bookmobile in 1949. So that bookmobile, the first one in Dothan, was a Chevy with a rear door and side panels that opened up to reveal 800 books. Actually, pretty good stuff.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised to see that number. That feels like a lot of books for that era, especially to fit into one vehicle.
And if you see a picture of this thing, it is not huge. It's about the size of what we would think of today as a panel van or an ambulance or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not all that big, but it carried books and magazines and films and phonograph records, and rural patrons could check these things out. It made a run every week or so through its entire service area.
That was actually going to be my follow-up question to that was how did they return them? I guess they knew the schedule, the local residents knew the bookmobile schedule, when it would be, where it would be.
The schedules were published in the newspaper, and they ran relatively regularly. That is, you kind of knew anyway what day the bookmobile would be in your area. And I don't recall if you had a 2-week checkout or a 1-week checkout, but it certainly wasn't much more than that. They wanted these things circulating and not just sitting inside of somebody's house, or if you're a professor, sitting inside your office for year after year after year, forgetting to renew it. Trust me on this.
The book equivalent of the old overdue Blockbuster tape.
Exactly.
For us 90s kids.
That's exactly what it is, yeah. So that inaugural trip of that bookmobile was on April 4th, 1949, and it ran, you have to kind of imagine the map of Houston County. It ran west toward Enterprise out to the little town of Wicksburg, and then it had 5 other routes, one of which went straight south toward Panama City, obviously not getting there, but down US 231, southeast along the Cottonwood Road, north along Headland Highway, and east out to Ashford along US 84, and then northeast to Columbia, which is Columbia is right on the river over there. Ms. Neal, the librarian for Dothan, had promised in article after article in the Dothan Eagle that the bookmobile would become well known in Houston County, but it was also really popular, like right off the bat. Just a month after its first trip, that is in May of 1949, a Dothan Eagle reporter followed it around and wrote that, quote unquote, a score of youngsters stopped by the bookmobile at Cowarts, which had a population of 200 in 1960, 11 years later, and quoted a resident there saying, quote, "This is one of the best things that has happened. The people are really going for it," unquote. Then in 1956, the library hired Wayne Love to drive the bookmobile. Now, later on, Love got his doctorate, and he became such a well-loved library director at the Dothan Library, then called the George S. Houston Library, that they added his name to the library. It became the Houston Love Memorial Library. In 1965, the library moved from that Troy Street address to a building where the original high school had stood and where Minnie Hurd Elementary School had stood, and then was rented out to the University of Alabama for an extension campus in did I say 1961? I meant in 1965. They made that move into that new building, and that building remained the Houston Love Memorial Library until 2014, when the new library building was built and the old library building became a parking lot right next to the new library building. Then they changed the name of the
As an
library.
aside, I actually covered with the Dothan Eagle. I covered that event when they dedicated the new library.
Well, that was a pretty extraordinary event, and there was a lot of controversy about how to deal with the library. So what they ended up doing there, as you well know, was to build a slightly smaller building downtown, and then over on the west side in Westgate Park to build a relatively large building, not larger than the downtown building, but a good-sized building as a branch library over there. And the Houston County Library System has a branch in Ashford, I want to say. I believe they still have that, but they also treat their Bookmobile like a branch. They consider it a branch. If you go on their website, you can say, well, there's a branch here and there's a branch there, and the Bookmobile is a branch. Well, Dothan bought a new Bookmobile in 1957 with a capacity of 1,500 books. And then a decade later, in 1967, they bought a GMC with a capacity of 3,000 books. And that's the photograph that I have that started this whole thing. It's blue and white. It looks like an odd school bus without windows. You enter from the back, and the inside doubtless was, as they all were and still are, they have shelves on either side and shelves against the bulwark right behind the cabin. That Bookmobile lasted, gosh, I can't remember how long. They've got a relatively new one now. They still circulate material for all age groups and interests, and the Bookmobile comes out about every 2 weeks to the Troy Dothan campus to the Early Education Center that we have out there. They provide a mobile Wi-Fi hotspot now. They offer laptops to use on their stops, and they still have books, magazines, journals, all that kind of stuff.
It's showing the modernization of technology, but also still tying back to that fundamental concept that started the Bookmobile all those years ago, which is keeping the community united and keeping the community engaged with their literacy and having access to things, because so many people don't have access to the going to a bookstore and purchasing a book. So this is the best way for a lot of them to get their hands on this stuff. Well,
and it sounds like we're Luddites to say that not everything is actually online or even accessible if it is online. So the Bookmobile still has an important role to play. And remember, technology is a tool. It to me should not be the thing that drives what you do. I don't live for my hammer. I use my hammer to drive a nail.
Right.
And still, a lot of people understand, and institutions understand, that technology is a tool to further the mission.
Absolutely. And we've seen, certainly, I think you would agree that the Dothan Houston County Library System has done a great job over their existence of keeping people's access to this and letting people have a chance to get their hands on the tools in order to achieve the mission of education, literacy, things of that nature.
Well, even the library building, the library infrastructure, the bookmobile itself are tools. They're technology. And yes, the Dothan Library, Dothan Houston County Library System now, since its inception in 1901, has been a resource for the community. It may be imperfect, and it may during its history have been imperfect, but it opened as a quote-unquote free library whose revenue stream came from memberships. But you could go to that library and you could read those books, and with restrictions. You might not be able to check them out. And then over the years, they just continued to do that. There was always a drive to make the library more and more and more accessible, at least within the social system of the era.
And obviously, they can read the blog post on Troy Today. But if people want to check out photos like this and more stories like this, tell people how they can get their hands on or their eyes on some of the content you guys have at the Wiregrass Archives.
The specific collection that this photograph came from that we use in this blog post is not yet posted. There's some restrictions on web publishing by the donor of that particular body of photographs, but eventually we hope that we'll be able to get all of those posted and organized in a way that you get to it. But to answer your question directly, there are a lot of digital surrogates in our collections posted to our website, the Wiregrass Archives, that's available through www.troy.edu/wiregrassarchives.
Outstanding. I would highly recommend it. Also would recommend swinging by sometime and checking out the archives in person at the Dothan campus. Is that still
We are a publicly available archives that serve the community and not just the university, and we welcome visitors. You do not even have to have what we would consider a research reason to come out and use our collections. Curiosity is all you need, and a driver's license.
So we've reached the end of this episode, but definitely not the end of the Wiregrass Archives. There is still so much to discover and so many more stories to be told on this podcast. You can find more information on your own at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives. If you like this podcast, be sure to tell a friend, and we'd love it if you left a review in the App Store. It helps other people find the show. I'm Greg Phillips, joined as always by Marty Olaf, Director of the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama. This episode was recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio and was produced by Austin Toy and Joey Hudson with help from Kyle Gassett. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back again soon to tell you another story, and you'll know it came from the archives.